Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Kim, thanks to László, my fellow panelists. Good morning. So I'm Andrea Lipps. I am a curator of digital design and the founding head of our digital curatorial department at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, located in New York, where I oversee a collection of hundreds of works by artists and designers who are engaging with data in one form or another. And so for my talk this morning, I sought to apply this lens of data as an artistic medium to work in Cooper Hewitt's collections, in our exhibitions, to offer a curatorial framework of sorts to help us think about and consider several overlapping strategies through which artists approach data as an artistic medium within contemporary practice. And of course, as a starting point, I'd like for us to think about data, of course, not just as information, but as inscription. Very much like pigment or marble, data has affordances, it has constraints, it even has material properties. And when artists work with data as a medium, they're not only expressing something through data, they're also asking, of course, what data is, who controls that data, and how it shapes our shared realities. And of course, this isn't new. I think for those of us who were at the reception last night, we of course saw the Mapping the Origins of Data project. And at the 1900 Paris Exposition, for instance, sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois and his students at Atlanta University created a series of seminal data portraits that documented Black life in post-Reconstruction America. So, for instance, the piece that's on our left, the assessed valuation of all taxable property owned by Georgia Negroes, here he is rendering Black-owned property value in these ever-expanding rings of 5-year increments that are pierced with spikes. So here what he's doing is suggesting the violent context within which Black people are attempting to own property. Or his chart comparing city and rural populations in which he uses a spiral instead of a straight bar to show how huge figures of information can't even fit on the page. So these were rigorous, visually striking, and bold, making the case for Black advancement in a very hostile global context. So here already in 1900, we're seeing, how data was a political act and a material gesture in his hands. And artists continued to certainly use data to reveal hidden structures. Of course, another piece that was on Veronica's mapping was Hans Hacke's 1971 Schapolsky et al. Manhattan Real Estate Holdings. This was a landmark work of institutional critique in which Hacke had used property records to expose one of New York's largest slumlords and the networks of urban powers around that. What was fascinating was that this project's inclusion in his planned 1971 solo exhibition at the Guggenheim led to that exhibition being abruptly canceled 6 weeks before it opened and to the organizing curator being fired. So projects such as these show us that when artists and designers represent data, they do more than just show us the world. They, of course, are shaping how we perceive and how we understand it, which I think certainly becomes acutely more critical with the rise of networked computing and sensor-based systems, because today no longer is data just a record of the world. It is actively producing it. It is training our algorithms. It's informing our policy. It's mediating our human relationships. So where data arguably has forms, perhaps rows and columns, perhaps timestamps and coordinates, it also has gaps, silences, and structures and power embedded in how it's collected, how it's interpreted, and how it is displayed. Theoretist Johanna Drucker, for instance, reminds us that data are what she calls capta. They are taken, not given, emphasizing the constructed nature of data. So what we choose to collect, measure, visualize, and represent reflects our very human assumptions. And so I would argue that when we say data as an artistic medium, we're talking about artist engagement with the texture, with the bias, with the context contained within that data, treating data expressively, poetically and critically, reframing it not as truth, but as terrain of inscription, interpretation, emotion, and resistance. So getting to a framework of sorts, these two previous examples could arguably be evocative of strategies that use data as revelation, in which artists and designers use data to reveal systems and patterns we couldn't otherwise perceive. And this is certainly a strategy often engaged when converting momentous changes in technology and science into works that people can understand and use. So one work that is in my collection is, of course, this work by American designer Ben Fry, Chromosome 20. He created this while he was getting his PhD from the Aesthetics and Computation Group at MIT Media Lab. And for this work, he mapped the 60 million bases of just one of our 23 chromosomes to make graspable the scale of the human genome. And so he rendered as legible letters what at the time was understood as the active code. And then he used dots to indicate the unused or the functionally misunderstood code. And then, Kim and László, we zoom way out to, of course, your work that we included in an exhibition that I curated. And then I ended up collecting this work, Visualizing the Cosmic Web, which you guys created in 2016, that uses simulation data from astrophysics to examine the possible underlying structures of the universe. So what looks like a lacework of filaments is actually the exploration of networks and connections among galaxies across billions of light years. And I mean, Kim, you really rendered this structure not with scientific labels or coordinates, but with this stark, almost mystical beauty, asking, what it really means to see something that we can't observe directly. And in so doing, I do find that, they turn cosmological data into both an epistemological question and an aesthetic experience. And so these works demonstrate how artists and designers use data to reveal, to approximate, to imagine invisible systems in our worlds, whether biological or cosmic. So another strategy, of course, is to consider data as critique, exposing how it encodes power, bias, and omission. A fantastic example that I really love is this work by Nigerian-American artist, Mimi Onyewoha. She began a series called The Library of Missing Data Sets in 2015, which is a physical repository of data sets that don't exist, such as publicly available gun trace data, sales and prices in the art world, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. So as you can see, there are these empty file folders that are contained in these metal filing cabinets to emphasize the data blind spots and exclusions that result from systemic bias, from lack of institutional will, or from the active suppression of inconvenient truths. So this artwork operates as both kind of archive and anti-archive, materializing what's been omitted from official records. A slightly different project, which is kind of fun and tongue-in-cheek, is by Australian artist and engineer Tiga Brain, where she is materializing the production of data in unfit bits. So this is a satirical and an absurdist guide for gaming fitness trackers. So Unfit Bits responded to a trend of employers and insurance companies that were incentivizing people to wear fitness trackers that linked their physical activity to corporate wellness benefits, even to insurance perks, better rates. So the project offered tutorials for how to fake your fitness data by attaching your Fitbit to a metronome, to a drill, to a bicycle wheel, potentially even your dog. So as Tiga Brain puts it, when data becomes currency, then forging it becomes resistance. And so Unfit Bits doesn't just critique the quantification of the self, it actually reveals how the supposedly objective realm of data is deeply entangled with coercion, power, and capital, turning data into this site of subversion. And even something like typography can become activism using data. So American graphic designers Ben Dosel and James Lee created Ugly Jerry from gerrymandered U.S. congressional districts that were carved from apportionment data into these very mutant shapes that they discovered kind of looked like letters of the alphabet. So the almost illegible letter forms exposed the distortion of democratic democratic representation. And similarly, the Climate Crisis font by Finnish typographers Aino Korkela and Daniel Kuhl is a variable font whose letter forms erode in proportion to real and predicted data on Arctic sea ice loss that was captured by NOAA and by IPCC. So each year, the data becomes more fragile. And in both of these examples, the form is following the data in which the letter forms almost become evidence, if you will. So collectively, these works use data not to, of course, reassure, but to destabilize, suggesting that data isn't passive, but very much structures how we live and becomes this material of critique. It's something that's malleable, contextual, and deeply human. And finally, of course, data as poetics. This is yet another approach that artists and designers take, positing data and even its production as something that's embodied, that's textural, that contributes to affective experience. So Georgia Lupi, who I believe isn't able to be here today, unfortunately, she has this piece in the New York Times. It was an op-ed that she put out in 2024, and I ended up collecting from her, in which she's chronicling her post-COVID symptoms over the years. And so what she did was tracked her health data in a spreadsheet and ultimately drew it all by hand, very much rendering the pain, the confusion, and the healing through annotated sketches, color, and these painted brush strokes. And George's practice overall is exemplary of a counter-narrative to data's supposed objectivity. In her hands, data is very intimate, it's very expressive. It's a form of storytelling that she calls data humanism, where personal experience and aesthetic expression can reclaim the quantified self. I had to include this lovely little piece. I actually don't know if sound is working. It's called MTA.me. Can you guys hear that? Yeah. Can you? Yeah, sort of. So it's created by American graphic designer Alex Chen in 2011. And it's a very simple piece, but I think it's really lovely. It transforms New York City subway data into a generative music instrument. So as trains depart and arrive, the sound of a plucked string plays each time the paths of two trains intersect. The pitch depends on the location of the crossing. So it's very playful, it's temporal and elegant. It turns logistical infrastructure into a living score such that data isn't just coordinates and timestamps, but it's tempo and texture and tone. And finally, the Johnny Cash Project, which was created in 2010. So this is actually a music video for one of Johnny Cash's last recordings that he had created in the final months of his life. It was then posthumously released. And within this project, what the creators sought to do was to make a video of a work that was both data generation and collective authorship. And what I find, number one, really fascinating about this is it certainly predates the aesthetic of Stable Diffusion by more than a decade. So what they ended up doing was they worked with thousands of fans from around the world to contribute drawings, which then populated a database and became a frame in this very data-driven tribute. And so ultimately what we're looking at is a very participatory artwork that treats individual contributions as data points that are woven together through this very algorithmic sequencing to create a dynamic and deeply expressive audiovisual experience. And so in this context, data becomes a poetic medium, not just a source of information, but a substrate for memory, for mourning, and for reverence. The work invites viewers not only to see Johnny Cash's image, but the collective emotional labor of a global fan base and audience, rendering data as a language of devotion and of creative multiplicity. So to conclude, what connects all of these works is a refusal to treat data, of course, as neutral, and instead to treat it as something that is designed, that is expressive, even contested. And of course, the approaches and strategies in this framework overlap. They're by no means comprehensive. But working with data as an artistic medium is to see it as more than a spreadsheet or a graph. It's a language, it's a material that reminds us that data doesn't simply represent reality, but it produces it. And by working with data materially, artists and designers reintroduce beauty, friction, even revelation into systems that could too often run on seamless abstraction. And I would argue that in our museums and in our institutions, data art challenges us to consider not only how we display data, but how we frame its ethics, its aesthetics, and its politics as cultural artifacts that are asking who defines what data is worth collecting, who interprets it, what kinds of knowledge and whose experiences get rendered visible by it. And even more expansively, how we might treat data itself, its infrastructures, its absences, its entanglements as a living cultural artifact, not just as a commodity, but as a commons. How do we keep data accountable, in Kim's words? Thanks.